The other day I asked on my story what art thing y'all would like to learn from me, so I was requested to do a hair shading tutorial. And I have this old illustration of Sela that I will be demonstrating on. So first I chose my base color, which his hair is black, so I chose like a purplish gray color. I don't like drawing my black haired characters with fully like rich black hair. That's just a stylistic choice. And that's usually always on a normal layer and just like a solid color. What I like to do next is I like to color pick what the skin color is, and I like to airbrush over the parts of the hair that like cover the skin. And I just like to lightly airbrush like the skin color over those parts of the hair, because I think it makes the hair look softer and more translucent. After I'm finished doing that, I create another layer and I set it to multiply. And I just create my basic shadows according to what your light source is, whatever that would be. And usually the color that I pick for the shadows is going to be a little more saturated, especially for Sela's hair. It's going to be a little more saturated than the base color, and slightly darker too, but usually the multiply function of the layer usually takes care of that. And with these shadows I'm using a hard brush, and I will go back and airbrush erase it later to make it softer, or you could just start with a softer brush and do it that way. I sometimes will do that too, but in this case I did use a harder brush. I used the Studio Pen on Procreate. And now that I've got my base shadows done, I'm gonna go in and erase with an airbrush tool. And I'll usually target the very ends of the shadows, or these little rounded parts that I drew. And after that, what I like to do is either on the same layer or a different layer that is also set to multiply, I will start drawing these little hatches in kind of like the divots of the hair. I did draw his hair very wavy in this instance, so it kind of goes out and then goes back in. And when it goes back in is where I'm trying to draw these little patches. And I'm also just using a hard brush for this. I'm still using the Studio Pen. And I like to draw them very dense at first and then kind of fade out. And I do these at different lengths. Usually they're longer at the beginning at where they're the most dense. And then they get a bit smaller when they're the least dense. And I just do this all over where I think it looks the best and where I think the shadow should go. And then next, on the hatching we just did, I like to erase from where the lines are the least dense towards the most dense. And then I like to erase on the sides of the hatches so that the lines look like they more so fade out than stop. And then next, I create a new multiply layer. Go with the airbrush tool and just like airbrush over all of the little hatching. And I like heavily add color from the most dense hatching towards the least dense. I get like a little more faded, kind of like the exact opposite of how I erased the hatching. And usually with this section I do pick a slightly different color. I picked a slightly pinker purple for this, just so it would have like a slight distinction from the hatching, and I think it just looks nicer. And next up is the highlighting. I usually either do highlights on an add layer or just like a normal layer. And for Sela's hair, it's usually like this very light purple gray. And I just do the same exact thing with the shadow hatching. I just do hatching all over where I think that there should be highlights. And because he has wavy hair, I do it on like the more curved part of the hair. Just like I did the shadows on the divots, I do the highlights on the curves. And I do the exact same thing with the shadows, and I airbrush erase from the least dense towards the most dense, and then I go in on the sides and I erase those too. And just like the shadows, I will go over the hatching with the airbrush tool, and this will be on a separate add layer. Even if your hatching was on a normal layer, airbrushing with the add layer just gives like a nice little glowy effect that I really love. And just like with the shadows, I made the airbrush layer like a slightly more magenta color. And usually in this stage, if you want to take colors from the environment, if you do have one, if you have a background in mind, or if you've already drawn a background, I recommend implementing those colors into your highlights here. And with this, you can either be done, or you could do what I'm doing right now, and I just airbrushed a slight highlight on the very top of the head. And I'm also going to go in and do a gradient on the base layer. Now, I don't do this all the time, but I do think it looks rather nice and it gives a lot of dimension. And that's it. That's how I shade hair. If you have any questions or requests for other tutorials that I can do, please leave that down in the comments.